And our Bible reading this week is in Acts chapter 18. So let's talk a little bit about what you'll find as you go through the chapter. Easy way to remember 18. It's the end of the second journey,
Right.
beginning of the third journey.
He didn't take a whole lot of time off.
Yeah, it is kind of
At least the way Acts tells the
yeah,
story.
yeah. When you get where is it down in verse
The
23,
end of the
when
chapter.
that transition happens, boy, it is really, really fast there. And so, a great way to sort of work the chapter, in addition to that, those two broad segments, is just to watch for places and people. For example, we have Corinth first, and Aquila and Priscilla are kind of front and center there. And then
Right.
as we begin that third journey, Ephesus is kind of popping back up as being especially important, and Apollos is going to become a key player there. And that seems to
Yeah.
me to be sort of the an easy way to go through the chapters. Just
Right.
watch for where they are and who the people are. In fact, that's true of a lot of the coming chapters.
Yeah, that's right. In some ways, we're seeing some anticipations here and there, as well as some of the issues that are raised that are going to, I think, kind of factor into the rest of the book, and some of the concerns that go on there.
Another thing that is useful to watch for in these chapters about the journeys is the word but. You're going to see that several times in this chapter. I marked verse 6 and verse 12. And I say to watch for that word because it often plays the contrast where things were going good and we had great success doing this and this and this, but then
Right.
this happened and that happened. And it's usually a transition point to some kind of problem, some kind of trouble, like we have here in chapter 18. They do good at the beginning. He gets, to working with Priscilla and Aquila, and devoting himself fully to the work after that. And then verse 6, but there's a problem.
Right.
And then verse 12, there's another problem that arises. Still dealing with opposition.
Right. And I think there's a couple of important things to say about that, David. Number one, I think it's interesting in verses, what is that, 9, 10, and 11. We treat Paul as though he's superhuman, but yet here's Paul needing an encouraging word from the Lord, because apparently the opposition is severe enough that Paul's personally troubled. And so literally he has to be told, do not be afraid, just like Jesus would say to the disciples back in the Gospels, as they did their ministry and different things happened. Paul has to be encouraged by the Lord not to be afraid in what he's facing there. I think the other thing that's interesting, verse 12, there with Gallio and that opposition. This is actually the first time that a Roman official has been asked to rule on Christianity.
And he kind of does it.
Well, and that's part of I think part of what maybe going on here that's worth thinking about is that's the point is, and why Luke would tell that in particular is to illustrate that for Christians who are reading this and maybe even need some sort of precedent, and when they're facing their own persecutions down the road, Paul, when he had to be tested by for the first time in some sort of Roman legal proceeding, Gallio, the proconsul, says nothing to see here. This is not this is a religious issue. This is nothing politically usurping Rome. And so I think it's interesting what Luke is doing here. He's showing in this section that Christianity, is not a threat to Rome politically, and that Rome should leave it alone. Of course it won't. But on the flip side, you also have this weird little line there in verse 18 then about Paul as he's leaving the area taking a vow. And so I think what Luke is doing here with knowing that Paul has taken a vow as well as been tried by the Romans, Luke is showing us that Paul's work is to be seen as neither anti-Jewish. That's going to be the accusation in Acts chapter 21 when he goes back to Jerusalem finally. Paul is teaching against the law and against the traditions. Well, Paul will still do very Jewish things like make and keep vows just like the Jews would do back in the old law. And at the same time as Paul's later in the Acts going to go on and face trial in Rome, well, the first time Rome tried him, there's not a problem here.
Right.
And so we see anticipations. Luke is kind of setting us up for anticipations of the coming conflict with Rome and with Judaism as he goes both to Jerusalem and to Rome in the coming chapters.
And I'm glad you brought up the Judaism thing, because we said, remember, when we moved into chapter 16, not to imagine that the Gentile thing is over just
Right.
because they've had the meeting in Jerusalem.
Right.
In fact, if you watch for it, this Jew-Gentile thing continues to thread its way, even in this chapter,
Right.
down in verse 6, that one of those points where it transitions to trouble, that concludes with, I will go to the Gentiles, right?
Right.
He faces trouble from the Jewish side, so he says, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And so
Right.
I think we just continue to see that present, even if it's just an undercurrent
Right.
underneath what's going on in the rest of the story.
And I'll add one more thing about that. We've mentioned in times past that Acts kind of makes the apostles relive the stories of Jesus. This is Paul's encounter. This Jesus and Pilate. I find no guilt in the man. This is the Jews delivering Paul to the Romans,
Right.
and him similarly saying basically, I find no guilt in the man. And yet that will not end the conflict for Paul. That did not end the conflict for Jesus.
So, thinking again about cities and people as we get to the end of the chapter, Ephesus is going to pop up at the end of the second journey.
He makes a promise to be back, which sets up.
Which, yeah. So I thought about that. I
Yeah,
thought about that
yeah.
setup piece that Luke starts dropping things that are going to come up and be really
Correct.
important later. And so when we get into 19, Ephesus really does become a big deal. And then there's that little snippet at the very end about Apollos, who himself is just a really interesting character, and sort of there's sort of a convergence of several of the things here. Aquila and Priscilla now have a role in this.
Right.
Ephesus is going to be important, has a role in this, and as a practical matter, what I really love is that as smart as this guy was, Apollos, and as capable, he still had things he needed to learn.
Absolutely.
And he was willing to let these tent makers sit down and teach him the lesson, a man
Absolutely.
and a woman. What a great story of humility that is, and
Yeah.
a great reminder, no matter how far we progress, we always have things that we need to learn. So great thing to ponder as you reach the end of your reading this week as a very practical application. Am I open to the things that I need to learn? Hope that'll help you as you spend your week reading Acts 18.